Hello, I'm Mandy Ribekow-Evans, and I'm going to be talking to you today about restorative practices and approaches. Restorative practice was formerly known as restorative justice. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and how I got involved in RP, and I feel very strongly about it, and also where it originated from and how it's used in schools and in all sorts of environments today. My journey into RP, approaches. I worked in a secondary school for 14 years as a head of year. And I found that as part of a head of year's role, we were very reactive. People would come to us with concerns about pupils, whether they were teaching them and had them issues in their own classrooms, or whether there were issues in the corridors, and would have an expectation that as head of year or pastoral leader, we just had to deal with it and sort it out. I found this consuming and also completely impractical, because I still taught. I was teaching Key Stage 3, 4 and 5, still marking, still carrying out the regular duties of a teacher in addition to my head of year pastoral role. In my second year, I was really fortunate to be able to attend a 3-day programme with Dr. Belinda Hopkins. We're going to look at some of her resources and a link to her a little bit later. And the training was focusing upon the restorative school. For me, it was a complete revelation. The course was, as I said, 3 days, which is a long time. And if you appreciate it, I'm going to be summing up the basic approaches in under 20 minutes today. When I have run training in my previous schools, and also for children getting involved in restorative practices, I have done it for anything from a whole day to 3 hours. Now I'm condensing it in to 20 minutes. For the Trust, I've run a session for 2.5 hours. 3 days was a great deal and it was very intense, but as I've said, it was a revelation. After a 3-day course, I tried to introduce the approaches as a whole restorative school. As you can see on this slide, the various ideas I had and I implemented were Year 10 mediators, so pupils who run a service with Year 7s, and the children could go and talk to them. It did work up to a point, but at times some of the new Year 7s found it a little bit intimidating talking to the much older pupils. So after a couple of years of running with Year 10s, who were marvellous at the time, I managed to establish it, or re-establish it, as a Year 9 peer listening service. The Year 9s were paired up with Year 6s when they came in for an induction day, so they could establish the friendly faces and that they knew who to connect with when they started the school in Year 7. We ran a Year 9 peer support service, which was open to Key Stages 3, obviously for children in Year 7, and some Year 8s, and there were cases where Year 9s went to talk to Year 9s as well. My role as a restorative practitioner within the school was to try, and the main aim of restorative practice is to link and restore relationships between pupil and pupil, pupil and teacher, and in some cases, teacher and teacher. Restorative justice becomes restorative practitioner. Final point on this slide is that the police are actively involved in the restorative practices. They still call it restorative justice, and there is a restorative justice council, which obviously works with different situations, much tougher situations in the wider world. And I will follow that on and tell you a little bit about them. My current role, working for the Trust, is an SLE focusing specifically on English. However, obviously this is still my passion, and hence me talking about it today. This is taken from the Restorative Justice Council. So if you have a moment to have a look at it, it's almost their mission statement. I will move myself along a little bit so you can have a look. I like the second sentence particularly. A restorative school is one which takes a restorative approach to resolving conflict and preventing harm. It enables those who have been harmed to convey the impact of the harm to those responsible. And the purpose of this is to look at the impact and then take steps collaboratively to put it right. A brief history of restorative justice. RJ originally came from and was being used very successfully with the Maori peoples, an indigenous population of New Zealand. They used restorative practice to preempt and solve conflict in their community. If you look at bullet point 2 in the red, I think it clearly indicates the success and the power of RP, or at that time, RJ. They were very concerned about the young people of their community, that they were getting into trouble, and that the police at the time were not dealing with it in an appropriate manner, that both sides were not being listened to. So the police, as you can see in bullet point 3, during the 1980s, looked at the Maori culture and looked at how they were using restorative justice or practices amongst the communities and were empowered by it and looked at the way that it can empower and resolve conflict. I'll give you a moment to have a look at bullet point 3. In the fourth bullet point, there's a little bit more information, obviously, about how New Zealand and then the Australian police forces, in collaboration with restorative justice systems, began to experiment with the process as an alternative to criminal prosecution and using punitive and conventional sentencing. In the past decade, therefore, or longer, the concept received widespread attention in mainstream justice systems. And then New Zealand in 1989 enacted the Children, Young Persons and Families Act to incorporate this process. So, how did this work in England? I'm just giving you a minute to have a look at this slide, and you can see how by the 70s the police force were looking at these approaches, but obviously then had to fine-tune it. The actual process can take anything from 2 minutes to the process, let me start again, can take anything from 2 hours to just 5-minute conversation in a corridor. If you are running a restorative practice session, an RP meeting, I want to stress and emphasize that you are there as a facilitator. You are not there as a judger and to make judgment. You are non-biased. You are there to help both parties make reparation and restore the situation and help those involved move on. Over the years, I have run RP meetings for, as I've said, pupils, over just basic friendship issues to full-on what are called restorative conferences, where I've had a whole host of pupils from my previous year group involved, where we had to listen to every member of that group and try and help all of them move on successfully. I've run sessions with staff to staff, not always easy, and with pupils and staff. Because I have worked on this and worked in this process and felt so passionate about the impact of it, I tend to use restorative approaches when I am teaching, which is this language I use when I'm working with children. I also utilise the skills at home. It's just become innate for me. So to run a session, you need to ensure that you have had time to listen to both parties away from each other. Then you can gather, obviously, a whole picture of what actually the process and what actually happened. So you need to hear their feelings and their perspective. So when you conduct a meeting between those parties involved, you have heard from both sides. When you bring both sides together, you need to ensure that you establish an environment that is for the two of them to feel comfortable and to feel that you're not there to judge. I usually open the session by saying thank you to both parties, thank you both for coming, and I appreciate the time that it's taken. And I re-establish the almost strict regime that I'm going to impose for that meeting. I have to ensure that both parties are willing to listen to each other, and I will stress and reiterate that if either interrupts the other one when they're talking or when I'm asking questions, that I will have to cease the meeting or stop the meeting. I have at times ceased a meeting where one party felt uninclined to listen to the other, which meant it wasn't going to be successful. It's all about feeling and perspective, and when someone feels wronged, the other party tends to lack empathy and think about how the other party feels. So, feelings and perspective, how are you even feeling right now? Thank them for coming. Then establish that both parties are likely to have a different perspective, but they have to be courteous enough to listen to each other. Whilst you ask the question to one person, just to share their story, ensure the other party is listening quietly, intently, and reiterate that their perspectives are likely to be different. More inclined this happens with pupils. Listen to each other, and as you're listening to both sides, ask them how they're feeling and how did they feel at that time. The third question is really the most powerful. The effect upon others. So actually ask the question, when the situation happened, can you tell us who was affected by what happened? Quite often, pupils struggle with that question because it's difficult to figure it out. So you may have to give an example. I will give you a scenario. If a pupil has gone out of the way to maybe antagonise a member of staff, and the member of staff reacts, and not necessarily in a way that's going to prevent conflict, you may ask the pupil to say, well, did this affect you? How do you feel this affected you? What other people do you think this affected? And it changes their mindset. The same applies to the member of staff. Obviously with two pupils, exactly the same. Two members of staff, exactly the same. The effect question is the most powerful of all of them. Because when they start listing all the people involved and also the time that this has taken, it's quite, again, an empowering moment. After both have opened up about the impact and the effect of their situation that they were involved in, Guide them to reach a goal together, but not make suggestions. They have to decide for themselves. Invariably, both want the same thing. They want to leave what's happened behind them and to move on. Invariably, that is the case. And then, what do you want to happen from now? So, for example, if it has a pupil that's caused difficulties in the class and there's been a breakdown of relationship with the pupil and the teacher, it could be that the pupil literally just wants to return to the lesson and move on, but there has to be a difference. There has to be a difference of behaviour. Equally, the member of staff is going to want the pupil to return, but also wants a change. So it could be as simple as the teacher requests the pupil always comes in and without any problem just goes straight to their seat, sit down and gets their pencil case out. I've been known quite regularly to ask pupils in a situation like that, do you think that's a fair request? Are all the pupils expected to go in, sit down and get their pencil cases and books out ready for a lesson? Pupils invariably say yes. The final bullet point on there is about restorative conferencing. This requires quite a bit of experience in the restorative process because it can involve a lot of people. As I said previously, I have run conferences that actually did involve 10 pupils. I've run conferences where it has involved parents and police officers and been part of that process. So that does require a lot of experience and confidence. I just will refer to Belinda Hopkins, that I mentioned before, Dr. Hopkins, who I was fortunate enough to be trained by. This is a link on this slide, and it is definitely worth looking at her website. There are various films on there to show you the process and to look at different situations for people who've experienced RP. But I wanted to bullet point again to clarify the process or the practice. I'm going to give suggestions on the next slide of the language one could use to run a restorative classroom. A classroom that involves active listening and ensures against conflict. So, using active listening, just use positive affirmation, but yes, I am listening, eye contact, very basic, because if people look away when we're talking, it just creates some sort of unease. I ensure in the classroom that I look around and look at all the children. In the current situation, it is difficult, obviously, for us to walk around a classroom. However, we can still always make eye contact and encourage children to make eye contact back. Avoiding conflict in your classroom. That is by using restorative phrasing, positive praise. The next slide I'll give some suggestions, not an exhaustive list, of positive affirmations to help diffuse conflict. Positive praise is self-explanatory. We're teachers, we should be knowing how to use it. Here are some suggestions of how to diffuse conflict in your classrooms. And I'm going to reiterate, this is not an exhaustive list. Using phrases as, "you do not like what they are doing," helps take children off guard. So, for example, if a child is making some deliberate or not deliberate low-level behavioural problems, such as tapping or repeated tapping, you've asked them politely to stop and they carry on, I have no hesitation in actually saying, in the middle of a sentence whilst I'm teaching, "I'm really not happy about what you're doing and it's making me feel a little irritated at this moment." Or, "some of the pupils around you are feeling a little bit irritated by your constant tapping." And then return to my normal teaching. I will actually say it in the middle of my sentence whilst teaching, delivering something. See how to encourage the students' own empathy skills. So, comment, Can you sense the other pupils around you, their feelings? Can you sense any irritation? Do you sense that they're feeling uncomfortable? Do you sense at all that blah blah next to you is getting a bit frustrated? I always, and it doesn't always happen, but I always, as much as I can, try to avoid using the word don't. And as I've said there on the slide, I prefer to use I will prefer, or it will be better. Don't is quite an aggressive word. If you say, don't do that, one's natural tone changes. It also, as I've said there, avoiding using the shouting experience. Shouting over people, it does more harm than good. If you have to project your voice, it's worth doing it as a shock tactic and when children least expect it. But project, not shout. My final slide is a link to a video that is definitely worth watching. It is on YouTube. It involves Peter Wolf. Yes, that's his name, maybe. But it's worth watching. It's a good 15 minutes long. And it shows you the impact of the restorative justice process. I don't want to spoil it by saying anything about it. And obviously, because it's 15 minutes, I just wanted to include the link. It really is incredible, the power of the restorative processes. I'm really pleased to say that obviously our police force now, in both the Met and Scotland Yard, do use restorative justice approaches as part of their system. It doesn't mean that we have to get rid of a punitive system. It is definitely not a softly approach, which maybe some colleagues think it could be, because you can still sanction a pupil and then before their return, they have a restorative meeting with those involved. That is, again, I keep using the word, but very empowering. I do hope that you've enjoyed this session. Obviously, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the process, but if you have to use it and you embrace it, I hope this has been a bit of a starting point. Thank you very much indeed.